Starting out the drawing as per usual, I just want to get the proportions blocked in so I know what size of ear I'm going to be working with and more or less what orientation it has on the paper. To do that, I'm choosing marks at the top and bottom, and I'm going to give myself kind of 3/4 of an envelope shape around the ear. Now, believe it or not, it's at this stage that we encounter the first structurally significant thing that you find about the ear. When your subject is in what is called a standard anatomical position, that means that their head is straight up and down so that the bottom plane of their nose and the bottom edge of the ear where it connects with the jaw are on a horizontal axis in relationship to each other. We find that the orientation of the ear between the earlobe and the top of what is called the helix is in fact not vertical, it's tilted back. So as you're blocking in the ear, make sure that you respect that axis. Now that we've got that blocked in, the next thing I want to talk about is something that thematically we're going to find several times when talking about the anatomy of the ear. We have along the outer edge of the ear what we call the helix. On the inside of the ear then, the most characteristic form that we have is called the antihelix. Moving down to the bottom half of the ear, we have a really easy one. We've got the earlobe. Everybody knows what that is, everybody knows what it's called, and that's what we find at this bottom edge where we're connecting to the back edge of the jaw. After that though, we have to get into some complicated little forms. Now if we go deep enough behind the ear, of course, we find the eardrum and all the stuff that makes it useful to us. But that sound has got to get in somewhere. So our ear hole is called, in fact, the external auditory meatus, and it sits right about here behind the tragus. Now the tragus then is this kind of funky little tab that sits in front of the ear hole, I suppose protecting it from like bugs flying in there and stuff. Now going back to the other side, continuing off of the form of the antihelix, we have another significant feature, and just like the helix and antihelix relationship, we have the tragus and antitragus. Sitting in between the tragus and antitragus then we have the ear notch, which is at the bottom corner of what's called the concha. The concha is essentially the depth that runs through the center of the ear and culminates in the external auditory meatus behind the tragus. Also, when lit from above, we find this really beautiful gesture in the cast shadow across the antihelix. Quite naturally, it informs us of a depth that's happening here in the antihelix. This depth is called the fossa triangularis. Now, in anatomical terms, a fossa is anything that is a hole or a divot, and triangularis, of course, just refers to the fact that it's kind of a soft triangle. Now, that's a lot of anatomical terms right in a row, but it's more or less all that we need to understand in terms of naming things about the ear. In the rest of this lesson, I want to talk to you about the forms of the ear, the characteristic shadow and light dynamic that we find there, and how to model those forms in the most efficient way. Now, more often than not, we'll find that the helix is casting a shadow across the antihelix. That means that the cast shadow is going to run through here across the form of the antihelix, following it as it raises here and it dips down here. Be careful not to commit to too much of a hard edge in that area. In reality, that cast shadow is rather soft, especially in this case. Then, of course, we have a very complicated situation down here at the bottom edge of the antihelix. I clarify this because we have two different types of shadow interacting in the same place. We have a form shadow on the bottom edge of the antihelix, which has to be communicated quite clearly. And then we have a cast shadow edge from the antihelix that runs across the inner forms of the concha and eventually hides behind the form of the helix. Now, heading down the helix into the center of the ear, we have a rather ambiguous lighting situation. What I think we find is a bit of a form shadow here on the bottom edge of the helix that as it lands inside the ear, then casts a shadow across this form just behind the tragus. Now the tragus itself then is represented by a sharp overlapping edge. It should be sharper than the cast shadow edge behind it. Why don't we go ahead now and kind of block in the values inside the shadows, just so we get an idea of what shadow and light impression in this exercise is going to be. In fact, while I'm at it, why don't we hit the entire ear with a bit of stump? Because I think that there is enough halftone in this ear that we really need to see value everywhere if we're going to be able to eventually pull out the highlights. So the sooner we get to that phase, the better. Now there's another thing happening too, and we can't really see it from this angle. But in fact, there is a section of the antihelix that's facing a little bit up, and once we get past this point, it starts to face a little bit down. That's where you see that highlight kind of dissipating once we get past this point. For sure, there's still like a rounded volume, meaning that the form is darker at its edges. The proper specular highlight is mostly diminished by the time we get to this point. Notice this highlight that sits right here. A highlight is always telling you where a plane is shifting. So we have then these two axes that are both turning here, meaning that the top edge of the ear, in fact, is not the brightest edge of the ear. There's a gradient that goes from the top being a little bit darker to this little rim here, getting the lightest areas of light the top of the helix has to offer. This passage is also turning under as it enters the center of the ear. So you want to be careful not to let this plane here be too light. So again, we'd just be kind of cheating our feeling for the overall form of the ear. It needs to curl under, it needs to get some value on it to do that. Now the place that you can see it most clearly is when we get to this edge here, just above the tragus. Do you see this little notch, this little divot? That is the bottom edge of the downturning plane of the helix, hitting the upturning plane of the tragus. While you're filling in these values, instead of focusing on how dark to make them, try to focus on how unified to make them. Make them as even a value as you can, rather than as dark a value as you can. So let's finally get to this bottom section of the ear. Here's what I want you to notice. There is a major plane shift that happens at the bottom edge of the antitragus. And it leaves the rest of this section of the earlobe, more or less, in a darker halftone. There is, however, a rounded form that runs from the antitragus down underneath the ear notch. It kind of connects those forms together. Also, the back edge of the helix here, behind the antihelix, when lit from this perspective, tends to give us a nice high key form that runs through and connects here. There's a lot of poetry in that line. Now, of course, this feels a little bit naked of value. It's tempting to maybe add a lot of halftone to it. I don't want to add too much. Maybe we'll just give it one little pass. So we can do something that I feel like shows one of the very interesting characteristics of the antitragus, and that is this little highlight that pops out here. So the thing that I feel like a lot of people get wrong is they push the highlight on the antitragus all the way to the top edge of the antitragus, and it's just not there. And we've reached a cool moment in the progress of the drawing where we have just enough unity to really feel the shadows, and I want to clarify some of their shapes and push some of their edges. Through here, and when we squint down, I see a lot of gradient extending outward from this section of the cast shadow. That means that there's an indentation in this form, or rather that this is a raised section of form. There's some very thin forms here, right? The depth of the ear is not really so dramatic that a shadow at the edge of one of its forms can kind of read more or less just like a gradation. It goes down to the form-ending boundary. I bring this up as being different because, generally speaking, we're used to finding a form shadow and then a form ending. Here, I think that the form shadow almost just becomes a gradient that leads to that form boundary. More so than finding, say, that core shadow edge that we're used to designing. I also want you to remember that anytime you find a highlight, it should tell you something about the values around it. Now that we have a highlight here, that we have a little bit of a highlight here, means that the other areas inside the concha are in fact not all that light. Okay, time for one last run around the bases. Just taking a shot at the halftones on the antihelix. Getting them a bit darker down here where form kind of tightens up a little bit before that highlight kind of gets broad through here. I also think, you know what, wow, look at me. I didn't get quite dark enough in the fossa triangularis. Maybe a bit more value inside the concha here as well. Just so we're sure we get a sense of how this area becomes the highlight and the other areas, of course, are not. Maybe we give ourselves just a bit more highlight down this edge. It's such a beautiful rounded form. It's a shame to knock that highlight down too much. Meanwhile, diffusing a little bit that highlight as it gets across the more rounded form at the top. Okay, I hope that you, like me, could continue drawing on this ear forever. But let's just stop here, and I'm going to point out the things that we talked about and those names that you can etch them into your memory and forever be able to recall all the things you need to know about the ear. We started here with the helix. We followed that up with the next rational form, which is the antihelix. Inside the antihelix, we have what is known as the fossa triangularis. Following then down to the bottom of the ear, we have the tragus and antitragus. Those are on either side of the notch of the ear, which is at the bottom edge of the concha, which basically represents the depth in the center of the ear. Even deeper than that, though, we have the ear hole itself, which we refer to as the external auditory meatus. Okay, at the very bottom, we have the lobe, but you didn't need me to tell you that. That brings us to the end of this lesson. Remember, if you want to get a lot better at drawing portraits, specifically drawing the features of the face and head better, follow the link in the description of this video. It'll take you to my Patreon page, and for a very small fee, you get access to tons of content and a community of artists that are working just as hard as you are to get better at portrait drawing.